that I finished the first drafts of the oyster chapter and the martini chapter, and then had my first migraine. So I think that was certainly a clear sign from my body that I had sort of taken myself to a place that was a little bit more challenging and certainly more emotionally honest.
And that was Alicia Kennedy talking about her new book on eating, The Making and Unmaking of My Appetites. And she is our guest on this week's episode of BooksAboutFood.com, the podcast. I'm your host, James Reford. Thanks for joining. And I mean this with respect and admiration that there's a lot going on in this book.
Okay.
There is. But usually I'll figure out a train of thought I want to go. This one, it threw me I mean in a good way, because there's so much going on. I wasn't sure how to approach things.
Yeah, no, it is a common sentiment that people tell me about my writing, but that I personally don't. It is my brain, so I'm quite intimately familiar with how it works, but I understand that it is like I mean I identify most strongly as an essayist, so I think I just let myself go in a lot of different directions.
I know that feeling, but also it works for the book because
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
you really get a feeling of time and place, and it really shows. I felt I got a feel of your thought process and more immediate sense of what you were going through at the time.
That's good to hear. Yeah, no, I tried to make it more immediate than I guess reflective, if that makes sense. And more about what each moment and each ingredient could mean at any time. Like there's obviously a clear chronology throughout the book, but there's also the chronology gets layered the deeper into the book you get, I think.
Could that be just a sign of maturing when life layers on you?
Life layers on top of you, yes.
This seems a very personal book. Was this hard to write?
No, not at all. I mean, some chapters were. There are chapters about my brother's passing and the aftermath of that were challenging in that they gave me my first migraine actually to write them. So that was an interesting experience that I finished the first drafts of the oyster chapter and the martini chapter, and then had my first migraine. So I think that was certainly a clear sign from my body that I had sort of taken myself to a place that was a little bit more challenging and certainly more emotionally honest than perhaps I had been with myself. And so because I see writing as a way of processing my thinking process, but also I guess in this book, processing a lot of feeling that maybe I had never acknowledged as well. It was definitely there were those challenges, but most of the time I felt pretty good about it, especially once I got to the mushroom chapter. I think the way the book is structured, it's sort of that from the introduction through the chapter on, I believe, martinis is sort of more my upbringing, my adolescence, my like making of an appetite situation, and then in from mushrooms through the conclusion, it's more immediate to what I've really been living for the last, 5, 6 years. And so that was a lot more light to write. So it was like a very heavy first half and a very light second half.
Was this somewhat cathartic to do this?
I don't know if I'd call it cathartic. I'd call it clarifying, maybe. And, to have to put a lot of ephemeral feeling and experience into narrative, it sort of made me have to consider what was important. What did the reader need to know to understand what was going on and to hopefully propel them into reading further. And so, yeah, I definitely wouldn't say maybe the first draft was cathartic, but the subsequent drafts were more about clarifying the situations.
Beloved rewrites that everybody does.
Yes, yes.
I guess since I'm located in New York, it's interesting for
Yeah.
me to follow along your own travels from being that toddler that ate like a king or a queen, I guess, however you want to phrase it, in Long Island to what you call the reverse migration to Brooklyn, and then to Puerto Rico.
Yeah. So
So
yeah,
that was,
kind of following my ancestry backwards.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and it's interesting because I feel, and so it's interesting how you talk about, if I read this correctly, is the food world seemed to open up when you got to Brooklyn. You know, you mentioned Long Island, there was no bodega down the street where you could get your M&Ms.
right.
Um, but
Well,
whereas,
actually, Huntington was where I felt things opened up for me in a lot of ways
what,
because I lived in the village and was able to walk around. So it was very different from Patchogue, which Patchogue now is very built up again. But for me, living in Huntington Village was really significant, and it's where I started to bake, and it's where I started to like sell things at the farmers market, and so that for me was a big awakening moment.
but I think it's when you got to Brooklyn when you realized the magic of having, Chinese delivery and pizza down the corner and
Of course.
just everything on the block.
Yes, absolutely.
So again, it sounds like a perfect building block. You go from a small town to a city, learning that, and then how did things change in Puerto Rico?
I mean, vastly, vastly different. But, here there's not really a robust public transportation system. The supermarket foods are lacking, let's say, not lacking in terms of, you can recognize it. It's basically the same as going to a supermarket in the States with, of course, different variation in the produce. But a lot of the food is imported in the supermarkets, and that means it's old, basically. So it's a lot of old onions, old potatoes. You can't really rely on those types of staples the way that you would somewhere else mindlessly. Like mindlessly kind of go to the supermarket and just get some onions and garlic and potatoes and whatever else you might need. Things are also expensive. Things are taxed at a very high rate here. And so it's just very, very different. But similarly to living in New York, I'm able to go to the farmers market every weekend. As of this year in Old San Juan, where I live, there's also a grocery store, small grocery store that sells local produce and stuff like that. So I am like, it's interesting because I am a lot closer to my food here in a lot of ways than I was in New York, than I felt it in New York, because I have relationships that by nature of it being a smaller community, I feel that I have, you know, more robust relationships with the people I am getting my greens from and my tomatoes from and my kimchi from and that sort of a thing. And also by nature of living in this kind of I constantly call Old San Juan like a medieval village. It's like a very small neighborhood on a rock, connected by a bridge to the rest of Puerto Rico. You just know people more, and that really changes how you live and how you exist. You see the same people day after day after day.
Well, that is going back to what people do. I'm thinking of stereotypically France, where or no, not even necessarily France by itself, but where people would know the vendors, would know who to go to and who to
Yeah,
speak with and who did the best of this and who did the best of that. And you build a relationship, which
yeah,
nowadays is more or less lost,
yeah.
um, unless you live in a neighborhoody place in Manhattan or something, stereotype. But it sounds like going to Puerto Rico in a way that's brought that back for you.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and it is also has a lot of other challenges. We recently went 4 or 5 days without running water because of an infrastructure issue. We have a lot of blackouts, so like, life has to work with a certain number of infrastructural challenges in that way. But there are some, very beautiful things about the neighborhoody smallness of it. Because I mean, even the whole population of Puerto Rico at this point is about 3 million people. Um, so, when you find your little pockets of who and what you care about, that people repeat, they keep coming up, that it's not just living in a neighborhood where you see the same people all the time. It's also the same types of people going to certain types of events and that sort of a thing. And so, it's by nature very oriented toward living with other people.
That sounds like a nice change from what a lot of times we're doing now, going to the
Yeah,
supermarket and
exactly.
maybe know the same cashier. That's about as far as it
Exactly.
goes.
Yes.
I was particularly interested in the chocolate chapter, and it sounds like that was almost contains a Proustian moment for
Moment,
you.
yeah.
When you said you bit into that chocolate and you realized, I guess, the global effect of food, and if I'm paraphrasing here, but it just chocolate was my portal into noticing that food came from somewhere, and there's a story of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. No, I think that for me, because it started with the labels on the chocolate, it started with going to that Wild by Nature and there being all this fair trade chocolate. It wasn't just Hershey bars and Snickers bars and that sort of a thing. And it wasn't the Godiva I'd grown up being excited about when my grandpa got it for me. It was something very, very different that told a very different story. And it told a very different story about what I wanted. That story was aligned with what I wanted to believe about myself, that I was progressive and that I was interested in the world and that I cared about where things came from and I cared about, that there weren't going to be harmful pesticides or child labor on the other side of my chocolate bar, on the other side of the world. And that's a big part, of course, about how people make decisions about food in general, right? It's like, what is this decision I'm making about what I'm eating? What story does it tell about myself? And is that a story I want to believe? And so chocolate was how I started to sort of construct the story of who I wanted to be around food as an adult. I had a very omnivorous upbringing and ate everything, loved everything. And then when I got to adulthood and encountered this chocolate, it became a very sort of different, it opened up that portal to me wanting to know where all of my food came from, and in chocolate I found like the same kind of variety that I had only really encountered before in apples, or where there's all these different types that give you different textures, give you different colors, give you different flavors. And so finding out that chocolate could be like about as robust in terms of difference in all of these capacities, that was definitely a moment for me that it opened up the rest of the food system, let's say, as a place of possible exploration, and a place of knowing, of a way of building knowledge of myself and of the world simultaneously.
No, well, certainly, I think chocolate on a global scale is probably much, well, global would be vaster than the local apple
Yes, of
scale,
course.
but certainly it's a great way for a young person, I can imagine, to really have a better understanding of global agriculture.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what I say, that chocolate is like, because we are born sort of believing in chocolate as a treat, as something special, as something, delicious. That, I think that makes chocolate a really interesting way to teach people about how the food system works.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you mentioned Godiva because, growing up, Godiva was,
Yes.
the high end. But now I probably wouldn't give it a second glance, really.
Exactly. Yeah.
I could just ask the elements or the ingredients that you've chosen for the book, because the book is broken up, the chapters are ingredients.
Yeah.
Um, no
More
recipes,
or
but just
less.
the ingredients that represent where you were in your life. How did you choose those? This is, I guess, a two-parter. So the first part is, how did you choose those?
Yeah, I think it was very sort of subconscious in a way, when we sold this book on a proposal, so it's not like I had written this like from the soul and went out and shopped it around, but I was trying to construct, how would I construct my sort of biography, my autobiography via the foods that have mattered to me the most. And so they had to be foods that had personal meaning as well as cultural, like gastronomic meaning for me, because it is a memoir, but it's very much also, you know, about where not just my place in not just these ingredients role in my life, but their role in like the food system and their roles in culture and maybe some history and that sort of a thing. Like basically it's asking questions about my personal appetite wound up with how we've established our modern appetites as a population. And so they had to have resonance that would be both personal and gastronomic. And so with apples, it's obviously an origin point. It's a very simple origin point. It's an origin point for so much myth and so much religion. And it's also an origin point for me being from Long Island and being someone who, like, growing up, was really introduced to abundance and choice when it came to apples. Like, that was one of those things where I can remember seeing and tasting and understanding that there was a robust variety with apples. And so that was very establishing for me. Um, there's obviously chocolate for myriad reasons. There's oysters and martinis, lamb because it was a meat that I really loved as a child. And I became vegan in my mid 20s. I'm vegetarian now, but when I was young, lamb had was the only meat I had ever cooked too. So it was, and so it had this layered way of telling stories. Lamb is also sort of, I don't know, feminized as a meat. So I was able to talk about food writing and feminization there. Um, mushrooms are important, martinis are important to me. But they all had to have these layered meanings. It couldn't just be I like them and they help me tell my story. It had to be I like them, they help me tell my story, and they move the narrative forward in terms of the questions I'm asking about commodity versus luxury, the construction of our desires and our appetites and that sort of a thing.
I just want to backtrack and say I
Sure.
think martinis are important to a lot of people.
Yes, of course. That's why they're useful here, but they're also useful because of the storytelling element, which is that we don't really know their origin in a specific historical objective way. Like so they were useful for me in that chapter because that's chronologically when I started to drink martinis, and they have this role in my writing about cocktails, and they have this role in my family life. But also it was useful for me because it's also about the stories we don't tell in our families, and the things we can't say to each other. And the things we can only say to each other with a martini. And so it helped on that level too, because it was something that it was significant to me autobiographically, but it was also significant in terms of, it was useful because it's about, how do we actually know what has ever happened in a family? We don't know where the martini really came from, and even when we're drinking martinis, we don't really know what's going on with our feelings sometimes.
Very true. Although I'm
Yeah.
surprised that I didn't realize that there was no origin official to the martini, which is sort of there.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
Now, so you have these elements or chapters. Did they change at all as you wrote?
Yeah, I expected chocolate, sugar, and pumpkins all to be in the same sequence. I expected to write more, I think, about my time as this vegan baker in Huntington, but then I decided that that story kind of had hit a natural conclusion and I wanted to get on with it. But I come back to the baking stuff in the sugar chapter and in the pumpkin chapter, but I come back to them very differently. So in those chapters, which come a little bit later in the book, I'm revisiting elements of the chocolate chapter and the chocolate biography, but but basically it's like in the chocolate chapter, I've become a baker, and then I become a food writer, and then I end up teaching food studies. And so with the sugar and pumpkin, I bring the food studies element into it, and so it builds on the experiences, but allows me to go back to some formative moments in the bakery and some formative moments as a food writer, and these how I'm like bringing students through sugarcane fields and bringing them to the rum distillery, and I'm bringing them to a restaurant and we're eating pumpkin flan and I'm answering their questions. And so those I thought that those chapters would make sense in this longer arc around the bakery, but then I realized that I had a lot more about to say about them if I brought them in later and added the layer of being actually in the field with students and talking about them.
Going back to your early days, would you say that your interest of food came from the fact that you were indulged as a kid somewhat, as you said?
Probably. Yeah. Yeah. I do. I mean, I don't think I would have ever been capable of recognizing, discerning what I really loved about food if I hadn't grown up in a family from my extended family, from my grandmother making me lobster and lamb to my immediate family, my parents getting really into sushi in the 90s. Like just a lot of like food was always important. My mom always really cared about food and what we were eating and we were I think I don't know to we I did have a relationship to food that was very different from people I was growing up around, which I write about too. My mom was always like she was a whole foods person without being crunchy, like before that was cool. Like it was never like you can't have I don't know, my brother loved Swiss cake rolls. Like we always had Entenmann's in the house. Like it wasn't like an against processed food thing, but it was that my mom always was like picking whole milk and we weren't afraid of fat and we weren't afraid of flavor and we weren't afraid of salt and we weren't afraid of there was never a question of you eat as much as you need to eat, as much as you want to eat. You treat yourself within reason, la la la. Like I didn't grow up with the diet culture around me that a lot of girls my age would have grown up with. A lot of pressure to be um, obviously I can admit that I didn't have a lot of pressure to be thin because I was when I was young like pretty naturally fit, so it wasn't like it was an issue, but at the same time it was never treated as a problem. My appetite was never problematized. And the way we ate was very, again, omnivorous. It was very, we ate everything. Everyone was very curious about food. Ina Garten was always on TV. And so, like, it was just a point of enjoyment and pleasure. And so I think because I grew up with so much pleasure around food that was not policed, when I got older and started to think about the complications in food, and the food system and the way things are gendered and the way things are inequitable and the way there are pesticides and the way there's factory farming, like these troubled me, but they didn't ruin food for me. And I think for a lot of people, especially engaging with my work, they maybe are still learning to have a really robust pleasure with food that I never had to be taught how to have. That was like given to me as sort of something that was natural. And so for food to become complicated made it more interesting for me. Like I find pleasure interesting, but I don't find pleasure to be interesting if it's the end all be all. I think the complications and working through those complications as, an intellectual and political problem is actually pretty fascinating. But I don't think I would have gotten there if I didn't grow up with food as this like great source of joy in my life. Joy and curiosity.
Right. So I think that's important. It's, for example, the oysters. You
Yeah.
simply enjoy the oysters. Maybe you enjoy where they come from and enjoy understanding the different varieties. You're not eating oysters for the sake of oysters because they're decadent or has that image.
Right.
And that
Right.
strikes me as a very healthy way to approach it.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people in regards to this book have thought that I it have seemed to portray it as having no pleasure in it whatsoever, which is shocking to me.
No, it comes across that you clearly you enjoy what you're consuming, but you're also questioning it and you're
Yeah.
curious about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Well, that's the
Direction.
whole, I mean, a lot of the time with this book, it's interesting because what it does is it just gets people to tell me about their small food memories that would seem so inconsequential, but are really They are the building blocks of how we make ourselves.
That's why I really enjoyed the first chapter with just this. I get that. They're
Yeah.
te this family is indulging the child, but they're also teaching her and teaching her how to appreciate things.
Yeah.
Actually, if I could just backtrack for a
Sure.
second, you mentioned lamb as being very as feminine, and do you feel that that in some way is how do I phrase this without being misogynistic? Do you feel that lamb is somehow downgraded? It's not considered like because of this the feminine mystique, to quote Jermaine Greer about that?
Well, I think that it's the lamb is thought of as meek, and it's not that it's devalued because I think lamb is quite highly valued as a meat. But I do think that the idea, the concept of lamb sometimes in our mat is small, it's meek, it's obviously because it is young sheep. So the relationship, the way it is in our mentality is different. And so when I was writing about lamb, I was using lamb to talk about being sort of single for the first time in a long time, living in the city, trying to be the food writer I wanted to be, and trying to figure out how I could do that while not eating meat, but talking about it through the meat that I really loved the most when I was eating meat. So I don't, it's sort of for me, it was about demonstrating strength even if I wasn't going to eat meat. It was about sort of trying to uh use lamb to say like I know what a good piece of meat tastes like, but I'm rejecting it on these grounds. And I'm also not going to sort of like be meek in the face of perhaps the difficulties of being a woman food writer, being a woman vegan food writer at that time, and what was going to be expected of me, my performance of that role, um, in doing so.
And I wish I could give credit to the woman who asked you this question. I saw a video or I read it somewhere, and I think you had said that it is difficult to call yourself a vegan or a vegetarian writer because
Yes,
that will pigeonhole you in, and you really have no room to maneuver or expand
exactly.
your craft.
Yeah, exactly. No, and yeah, a lot of that chapter, the lamb chapter, it's about lamb and why did I love lamb so much, but also how do I remake myself as a person who has this palate developed omnivorously as a vegan or vegetarian food writer when it seems like no one thinks that that is a role that it can even exist, right? Like to be a food writer, you have to eat everything, you have to eat, I mean, that's like what Anthony Bourdain says in the first line of Don't Eat Before Reading This is it's like you have to love the blood and the guts and the la 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 la. And I think I in my own way, love the blood and the guts. They're just not the same. They're just not from an animal. And so, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I do think it is difficult still to sort of name yourself as a vegan or vegetarian food writer because there is a lot of baggage that people bring to those labels.
And I guess I was also curious, getting back to the feminine aspect,
Yeah.
you had said that you were concerned about going into cooking or writing too much about it because you didn't want to, again, I guess, stereotype women's roles as being in the kitchen, if I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing that right. You didn't want
Hmm.
to make it seem too domestic.
Yeah. I didn't want to be domestic at all. And yeah, I wanted to work in magazines and I wanted to maybe make a beautiful cake here and there, but I never wanted to cook. Yeah, when I was a kid, my mom told me, even though we loved food and highly valued food, my mom was like, if you learn how to cook, you're going to do it every day for a man for the rest of your life. She had a lot of resentment about that. And it's funny because since I've put the book out, a lot of people have told me who are my age that their mother told them the same thing. Their mothers, their grandmothers told them exactly the same is don't learn how to cook because it will doom you for the rest of your life. And so for me it was I didn't have any problem with that. I wanted to reject a life of domesticity. I wanted to reject all of this stuff. I had these grand ideas for myself about what I was capable of and what alternatives I could manifest for myself. That all kind of went awry for a minute, which is the chocolate chapter. But I do think that, I was quite comfortable with that. But it ended up being that food was the thing that, opened up my world, opened up myself creatively. I had so many, I like just bursting at the seam with ideas and with energy in a way that I just hadn't been before that moment.
So you've got this book that's going out. It's getting a lot of positive press and whatnot. What's next for you?
I don't know. I mean, I have an idea for my next book, but my agent has been on maternity leave, so I don't know where I am yet with that. And then I might actually apply for some PhD programs. I might, I'm just, other than that, I'm just doing my work per usual.
You do have a website of your own.
Oh, From the Desk of Alicia Kennedy is my newsletter. We have a great community on Discord. I publish a magazine called Tomato Tomato, which is like bi-monthly right now. It will go quarterly, of food writing about culture from around the world. And I teach writing workshops, essay workshops, and that sort of a thing. And yeah, that's what I do. I'm bad at that kind of promotional moment.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you taking the time, and it's been a great conversation.
Yes, thank you.
And once again, our thanks to Alicia Kennedy for taking the time to talk to us about her book on eating, the making and unmaking of my appetites. I'm James Gifford, your host, and this has been booksaboutfood.com, the podcast. And until the next time, happy reading.